Chapter 19. The Outbreak of the Fourth Ashanti War, 1822 to 1824. Sir Charles Macarthy, the Governor of Sierra Leone, under whom the British possessions on the Gold Coast were now placed, arrived at Dix Cove on board HMS Iphigenia, Commodore Sir Robert Menz, on the 27th of March, 1822, and having been ashore there, to explain the change to the inhabitants, re-embarked and reached Cape Coast the next day to assume the government. He was accorded a most enthusiastic welcome by the people, and on the 29th the new charter and proclamation were read. The ships were decorated with flags, and a royal salute was fired from the castle. The transfer having been quietly effected, the governor re-embarked on the 30th to visit Anamabo and Accra, and then returned to Cape Coast at the end of the second week in April. The difficulties with which Sir Charles had to contend were very great and can hardly be overrated. He was a complete stranger to the country, and the officers of the old company of merchants, many of whom could have given him valuable information and advice, were so jealous of the transfer of power that they refused almost to a man to serve under him or take any part whatever in public affairs. The governor was thus left to grope in the dark, with no one who was really competent to do so to assist or advise him. Before he left England he had seen Dupuy, who gave him all the information he could, and has left it on record that Sir Charles then seemed fully impressed with the importance of coming to a friendly understanding with the Ashanti. But after his arrival on the coast, where he heard nothing but the one-sided version of recent events given by interested natives and others, he seems to have been too easily persuaded that the Fantis were a grievously oppressed race, who had been most unjustly menaced and ground down by the Ashantis, and that the only possible way of relieving them from this tyranny was by means of the sword. He had now forgotten all that Dupuy had told him, or had allowed his judgment to be overruled by the tales he had heard and by the officials of the old company, any one of whom would have been only too ready to ridicule any statement made by the former consul, and the other side of the case, upon which it must be admitted there was a great deal to be said, was never again properly laid before him. Moreover, though it is true that after the arrival a few persons warned him that the Ashantis were not foes to be despised, he never seems to have had any real conception of the extent of their military organization and resources. Sir Charles Macarthy's measures, therefore, were all directed to crush the power of Ashanti. His first step was to reorganize the old garrisons of the Company of Merchants into a new corps consisting of 3 companies and called the Royal African Colonial Corps of Light Infantry. The people were also assisted to combine their forces with some show of method and provided with munitions of war, and a native militia was enrolled. A Swiss redoubt or fort was also raised on the summit of a hill, still known as Macarthy's Hill, on the eastern side of Cape Coast town, and called Fort Macarthy. The governor recommended that only Cape Coast Castle and the forts at Accra, Anamabo, and Dix Cove should be retained, for most of the others were in a dilapidated condition, and it was not thought worth while to incur the expense of their repair. In 1823, Parliament granted £17,800 for the civil establishment on the Gold Coast, and separate provision was made for the military. The governor, believing that he had now done all that was possible to improve the defences of Cape Coast, returned to Sierra Leone during the second week in May, leaving Major Chisholm in charge of the Gold Coast, with Captain Lang of the 2nd West India Regiment to complete the organization of the new forces. Unaided as he was by those in whose power it lay to assist him, it never seems to have occurred to Sir Charles that there might be more than one reason for the silence of the Ashanti king, and that the cause to which he himself attributed it, namely fear, was the least likely of any to be the true one. The few Ashantis who still came down to the coast had all been sworn to silence before they left Kumasi, and consequently no information was obtainable as to what was taking place in the interior. It was therefore quite possible that the king might be engaged for the first time being with some other war inland. The governor, moreover, knew nothing of the amount of preparation necessary and the length of time required for the propitiation of the gods by various ceremonies before the Ashantis ever engaged in a war of any magnitude, but which would alone have been sufficient to account for a few months of apparent inactivity. The king, however, was anxious to avoid the necessity for going to war at all, and hoped that, now that Mr. Smith had gone, he might at last be able to settle the differences between him and Cape Coast peaceably. He was in fact waiting to see what this change of governors would bring forth. Had negotiations been reopened at this time, the king, now that his old enemy Smith was no longer in office, would have been found ready to listen to reason. But unfortunately, Sir Charles felt so convinced of the uselessness of such a course of action that he never attempted it, and did not even send the customary formal message notifying the king of the change in the government and his own assumption of power. He therefore not only remained in ignorance of the king's sentiments, but also deprived himself of all opportunity of hearing what there was to be said on the other side of the case, and weighing the arguments for and against the justice of the Ashanti claims. Tutu Kwamina, therefore, conceiving himself to have been deeply wronged and insulted, and believing that the English had broken faith with him over the treaties, after patiently waiting for 10 months for further news from Mr. Dupuy and renewing the trade with Cape Coast, now found the new governor showing every sign of a determination to continue the policy of his predecessor by treating him and his claims with contempt and encouraging the people of Cape Coast in their rebellion against him by the involvement of an army and a further increase in the defences. Sir Charles McCarthy was so severely handicapped and was so obviously contending against great difficulties for what he honestly believed was right and just, that he scarcely ought to be blamed for the opinions he formed and the action he took. But this is unfortunately only one of several instances, some of great and others of minor importance, in which ignorance of the history and customs of the people has led to most regrettable and even disastrous results. In May 1822, an Ashanti trader who had come down to the coast quarrelled with a mulatto sergeant named Kujo Otetefo at Anamabo. The sergeant lost his temper and grossly abused the king of Ashanti, and it was this insignificant event that provided the spark that was soon to set the whole country in a blaze of war. Tutu Kwamina must by this time have become convinced that war was inevitable, and that it would be in vain for him to temporize and oppose the wishes of his chiefs any longer. It is possible, therefore, that he may have seized on this pretext for commencing hostilities, but at the same time it must not be forgotten that the offence of the sergeant was, according to Ashanti law, an extremely serious one and punishable by death. The king, therefore, knowing full well that it would be useless to make his complaint and ask for redress under Article 4 of Burdich's treaty, and feeling that if he must persist much longer in opposing the wishes of his chiefs and ignoring the continued insults of the Fantis, his own position on the stool might be endangered. He may have felt constrained to deal with the matter himself, without having any motive beyond the actual punishment of the offender. According to one account, indeed, the king was so loath to give the British government any cause of offence that he pardoned the sergeant after his arrest, and it was his chiefs who then took the matter up and issued orders for his execution. There is, at any rate, no clear evidence that the king himself was directly responsible for the man's death. Be this as it may, in the following November, the sergeant was seized between Anamabo and Egia and taken to Dunkwa, a village about 15 miles inland. There he was put in log, that is, secured to a heavy piece of wood by means of an iron staple over the wrist or ankle, the usual native method of securing a prisoner. The Dunkwas, who were on friendly terms with the Ashantis, were probably only too glad to have an opportunity of gratifying their revenge on a soldier for the death of their chief, Paintree, who had been killed in the skirmish at Mori. The news of this hostile act quickly brought Sir Charles McCarthy back from Sierra Leone. He landed at Cape Coast in December and at once went over to Anamabo to investigate on the spot the circumstances in which the sergeant had been seized. His journey was a triumphal progress. The Anamabos and people of the other villages through which he passed hailed him with enthusiasm, while on his return to Cape Coast on the 10th, he was accorded a perfect ovation, and the streets and hills thronged by crowds of Fantis who showed every sign of delight and vied with one another in cheering, firing guns, drumming, and blowing horns to do honour to him whom they now regarded as their deliverer. The people of Cape Coast, indeed, had every reason to rejoice at the attitude adopted by the governor, for they were in a serious predicament, cut off as they were from their neighbours and the objects of Ashanti wrath. Nothing could now have saved them from destruction and even complete extermination had the English declined to interest themselves on their behalf and undertake their salvation. Captain Lang now volunteered to go to Dunkwa or even to Kumasi to negotiate for the release of the sergeant, but his offer was declined, though it is quite possible that had such negotiations been permitted, war might even yet have been averted. On the 2nd of February 1823, news was brought to Cape Coast that the sergeant had paid the penalty for his treasonable utterances with his head. A nephew of the king had arrived at Dunkwa with one of the state executioners and 200 or 300 men a few days before and put him to death, taking his skull, jawbone, and one of his arms to be shown on his return to Kumasi. On the 21st, it was reported in Cape Coast that Aduku, the king of Mankasim, and his people had left Dunkwa, where the Ashantis concerned in the execution of the sergeant were thus left practically alone. Sir Charles, therefore, determined to secure them. The regulars and Cape Coast militia were quietly called into the castle at 6 o'clock that evening, and ammunition was served out, and the party marched before 7. Dunkwa is only about 20 miles from Cape Coast, and they should have reached it long before daybreak, and have been able to surprise and capture the Ashantis without trouble. But whether from wilful treachery, or fear from the enemy, or through carelessness or ignorance only, Sam Brew, who was acting as guide, took the wrong road, and the troops never reached Dunkwa at all, but after suffering greatly from fatigue and hunger, were suddenly ambushed long after sunrise on a narrow path in a dense bush near Tuanko. The Ashantis, who had a strong party of Fantis with them, opened a heavy fire, and though the advance guard of the men of the 2nd West India Regiment under Captain Lang and Ensign Reverall returned it and pushed steadily forward, they soon found that they were only going farther from their destination and could not possibly accomplish the purpose for which they had been sent out. They therefore fell back to Anamabo. The losses of the English in this affair were 6 men killed, 4 men missing, and Lieutenant Swansea of the Royal African Colonial Corps and 38 men wounded. But though the expedition had failed in its object, it had the effect of convincing the people once and for all that the governor was thoroughly in earnest and would not shrink from any means he might think necessary to gain his ends, for an expedition of this nature was quite a new departure, and no British force had ever before left the settlements to assume the offensive against an enemy in the bush. According to Cruikshank's account, Tutu Quamina now made a last effort for the preservation of peace by sending an offer of negotiation for the settlement of all differences through the Dutch governor, but it was contemptuously rejected. Although this statement is not supported by other writers, it is quite possibly true, for when Cruikshank was writing his book he had access to the old records of Cape Coast Castle, now long since lost, and the historical portions of his work were largely founded on them. Possibly therefore he had seen a letter from the Dutch governor in reference to this matter. Moreover, this statement receives some support from an Accra tradition given by Reindorf, which alleges that the skull of the Anamabo sergeant was sent down by one of the Ashanti princes, Owusu Pera, and other important messengers to Accra with proposals for peace, and that these were rejected and the messengers ordered by Mr. Blenkiron, the commandant of James Fort, to return. The Accras were still friendly with Ashanti, and a steady trade in powder, salt, and other articles was being carried on there, not only with the Ashantis themselves, but also with a number of Fanti smugglers who were supplying them with ammunition. Sir Charles therefore determined to try to wean these people from their allegiance. He left Cape Coast on board HMS Glendower on the 14th of April and landed at Accra on Wednesday the 16th, when he was accorded an enthusiastic welcome by the people, and with the help of the Danish governor, persuaded them to join the other English allies. The task was rendered all the easier by the vivid recollections the people had of the extortions and privations they had endured when Amankwa Abinoa's army had been encamped in their country in 1814. The governor then enrolled a local militia and returned to Cape Coast on the 8th of May. It was not long before the Accras were afforded an opportunity of proving the sincerity of their promises, for Sir Charles had barely left the town when some Ashantis arrived at Christiansborg to purchase powder and were promptly attacked and dispersed by a company of the new militia and a detachment of the garrison of James Fort. A few days later, a second party of Ashantis arrived for a similar purpose, and being refused by the people of Christiansborg, deliberately shot a mulatto and 4 other men who were coming out of the castle. The Accras at once flew to arms and fell upon the Ashantis, 14 of whom were killed, while the remainder made their escape and hid themselves, either amongst the bushes or in the houses of those they still considered were their friends, and others again sought protection in the castle. Later, when they endeavored to escape to Ashanti, 40 more were killed, and 24, with 5 Fanti smugglers, were brought prisoners to James Fort. The governor now thought he had put the whole country in a thoroughly satisfactory state of defense, and believing there was no immediate danger of an invasion, sailed for Sierra Leone on the 17th of May. When the Crown took over the Gold Coast settlements, it had been decided not to retain any European garrison, chiefly on account of the terrible mortality that had always existed amongst the men serving in the old disciplinary corps. They had been sent to the Cape of Good Hope, and Sir Charles Macarthy had brought a company of the 2nd West India Regiment from Sierra Leone to replace them. But he now applied for the return of these white troops, and at the same time asked that their strength might be made up to 1,000 by recruiting in England. 2 companies of the Royal African Corps were therefore sent up from the Cape, and had arrived at Cape Coast in April 1823. Besides these men, there were 3 black companies of the same corps, and a company of the 2nd West India Regiment, which altogether provided a force of about 500 regulars. The Ashantis now made their first move. An advance party of about 3,000 men crossed the Pra at Prasu on the 4th of June, and on the 11th Captain Lang was sent up by Major Chisholm with a large force composed of regulars, the new militia, and native allies to oppose their advance. The approach of these troops compelled the Fantis to fall back across the border, and at the same time removed the last doubts of the still wavering Fantis as to the real intentions of the English. Appiah, the chief of Ajumako, who had hitherto held aloof, now joined Captain Lang with 1,200 men, and most of the other chiefs quickly followed his example. But Kwesi Amankwa, the chief of Esikuma, still remained loyal to Ashanti, and not being strong enough to risk an engagement, retired before Captain Lang's advance and retreated to the banks of the Pra. Esikuma was burned, and the English force then returned to Cape Coast. At the end of July, news was brought to Cape Coast that a 2nd Ashanti army had crossed the Pra with orders to proceed to Elmina. Captain Lang therefore proceeded to Dunkwa to intercept it, but though he remained encamped for some time there, he never saw anything of the enemy, and then moved up to Yankumasi Fanti. Before leaving Dunkwa, he visited Elmina and received the assurance of the acting governor that the Dutch and Elminas would observe a strict neutrality and not allow any Ashantis who might succeed in penetrating to the coast to remain in the town. In the meantime, Kwesi Amankwa had been reinforced by the Ashantis and reoccupied Esikuma, where he was attacked at dawn on the 13th of August by Appiah, who put him to flight and took 80 prisoners. On the 18th, however, Amankwa, who again had been reinforced by the Ashantis, returned and pressed Appiah so hard that he was forced to send an urgent appeal for help to Captain Lang at Yankumasi Fanti. A detachment of the 2nd West India Regiment, the Anamabo militia, and some native allies were at once sent to his support. This force reached Ajumako on the 20th and arrived next day at Esikuma, where Appiah's advance guard had been defeated by the Ashantis that morning after a sharp engagement. The enemy was still occupying the place, but on the approach of this force they retired without firing a shot. The bodies of the Fanti prisoners they had taken in the morning were found lying in the camp, still warm, having been massacred immediately before the retreat. It was then nearly dark, and immediate pursuit was out of the question, but next morning the troops advanced in 5 divisions, and suddenly came upon the enemy, who were taken so completely by surprise that they were seized with panic and fled in the greatest disorder, leaving their dinners still cooking on the fires and the camp strewn with arms and baggage. The Fantis, now that they had the Ashantis in full retreat, might have struck them a severe blow, but they were tired by their march, and nothing would induce them to pursue. They were tempted by the food and plunder they saw all around them and preferred to sit down and eat and loot the deserted camp rather than follow the enemy and run the risk of being defeated. The Akras were now called up, and a force of 1,600 men, including the Danish Akras, was soon ready to take the field. Two standing camps were formed, one at Mansu, garrisoned by the Anamabo militia and most of the Fanti irregulars under Captain Hutchison and Fraser, and the second at Jukwa, where a detachment of regulars and the Cape Coast militia with a few other natives were stationed under Lieutenant King, R.N. The object of this second camp was to cut off the enemy from all communication with Elmina and prevent them from obtaining further supplies of ammunition. Captain Lang himself, with most of the regulars, then returned to Cape Coast. On the 28th of November, Sir Charles Macarthy arrived from Sierra Leone, bringing with him a third white company of the Royal African Colonial Corps, which had been raised in England. He was welcomed everywhere with sign of loyalty and delight, and very soon after his arrival went up to Jukwa and inspected the camp there. On his return, he proceeded on the 15th of December to Anamabo, where he inspected the militia and was received by all the chiefs, including Apia, who came down purposely to see him and made a most imposing entry into the town with an enormous retinue. All the chiefs were loud in their protestations of loyalty and devotion, and on the 20th the governor visited the other camp, which had now been moved from Mansu to Yankumasi Fanti. Here, other chiefs, before swearing allegiance, required the governor's solemn assurance that he would never make peace with the Ashantis without first consulting them and their interests, for they had not forgotten how Chibu had been betrayed by Colonel Terrain and had no wish to meet a similar fate themselves. After visiting Dunkwa, the governor returned to Anamabo and on the next day to Cape Coast, where he inspected the Royal African Colonial Corps on the 25th and presented it with colours. It had been Sir Charles's intention to visit Accra and inspect the force under Captain Blenkiron, but news was now received that the main Ashanti army had crossed the Pra and was rapidly marching towards the coast in 12 divisions. Orders were, therefore, sent to Captain Blenkiron to advance with his force and threaten the enemy from that side, while Captain Lang was instructed to lead the Fantis into a scene and create a diversion in that direction. The governor himself then proceeded to Jukwa on the 29th, where the Royal African Colonial Corps, a detachment of the 2nd West India Regiment, and with some of the militia, were then encamped. A force of 2,000 men had been concentrated here by the 4th of January 1824, and troops were then sent to occupy Amponsassu, a village on the left bank of the Pra, and Major Chisholm was called up from the coast. On the 8th, definite information of the enemy's movements was at length received. They were reported to have entered western Wassau and to have defeated the native allies in that district, who were now in full retreat. Major Chisholm was at once sent to Amponsassu with orders to take over the command of the troops stationed there and to await the receipt of further instructions from the governor, while Sir Charles took the remainder of the troops and leaving Jukwa on the 9th, advanced through Bensu and Heman to Dera Bouassi. He was accompanied by Captain Ricketts of the 2nd West India Regiment, who acted as his brigade major. His aide-de-camp, Ensign Wetherell of the same corps, Mr. Williams, the colonial secretary, and Surgeon Beresford Tedley. The whole force with him consisted of 80 Fantis, but recently enrolled into the Royal African Colonial Corps under Ensign Erskine, 170 men of the Cape Coast militia officered by some of the traders in the town, and about 240 unorganized fanties under their own chiefs. With this insignificant and almost undisciplined force, with only 20 rounds of ammunition for each man and some loose powder and slugs, most of which was soon spoiled by rain or in fording streams, Sir Charles, falling into the too common error of underrating his enemy, and deaf to the remonstrances and advice of the King of Jukwa and other chiefs, now purposed disputing the advance of an Ashanti army of unknown strength, composed of men who were not only inured to bushfighting, but were also confident of success and flushed with recent victories, and who, as it afterwards turned out, were from 10,000 to 20,000 strong. Not content with splitting up his available force into several divisions, he must needs select the weakest of these with which to meet the enemy. Nothing more foolhardy can well be imagined. On the morning of the 13th, this miserable little handful of men crossed the Pra, an operation that took some time, as there were only 8 small canoes available, none of which could carry more than 2 men besides the canoeman at each journey, and on the 14th, after many difficulties with the carriers and delays from the almost impassable state of the road, Sir Charles reached Isamankau, where he halted for 5 days to give the people of the surrounding districts an opportunity to join his force. Here they fortunately found Mr. Brandon, the ordnance storekeeper, who had come up from Secondi with supplies of ammunition. On the 17th, the governor sent orders to Major Chisholm, whose force comprised the main body of the army, to join him without delay, but by some extraordinary blunder, this letter was entrusted to a man who knew nothing of this part of the country, and who was so long in finding his way to Ampensassu that it was not until the 22nd that it was delivered. The Wassau's and Denkeras, who had tried to dispute the advance of the invading army, were now reported to be in full retreat, and Mr. Williams, the colonial secretary and adjutant general of the militia, was sent to intercept them and induce them to halt in a suitable camping ground until the governor could join them with his troops. He found some difficulty in checking their flight, but finally succeeded in persuading them to form a camp on the banks of the Adumansu, a small tributary of the Pra. On the 20th, Captain Ricketts arrived in the camp after a very trying march over the 20 miles of road from Insamankau. The paths in many places were waist deep in mud and water, and he and his party had been compelled to spend the night in the forest in drenching rain. He brought up the whole of the force under Sir Charles, with the exception of a small guard that was left to bring on the ammunition. Captain Ricketts at once ordered the Denkera and Wassau chiefs to set their men to clear the bush around the camp, and very soon afterwards had to mount a strong guard of militia over the Wassau's, who were already trying to cross the river and desert. During the afternoon, an alarm was suddenly raised that the Ashantis were about to attack the position, and the whole force stood to arms for 5 hours in pouring rain, but no attack was made, and nothing was seen of the enemy, though they were known to be no great distance away. On the 21st, Sir Charles McCarthy arrived, escorted by a bodyguard of 200 fanties, provided by Chief Appiah of Ajumako and 40 Cape Coast men. With him came Kwesi Yaku, the aged chief of Isamankau, who being too infirm to walk, had to be carried the whole way by some of his people. Several hundred commanders were also on the road, but they had halted to rest and had not yet come up. The governor had come the whole distance from Insamankau on foot. but after a short rest proceeded at once to inspect the position. He then went across to see the Denkera and Wasau chiefs. But while he was thus engaged, the alarm was raised that the Ashantis were upon them and about to attack. Sir Charles can have had no idea that this was in truth the main Ashanti army, for instead of falling back to join his main body under Major Chisholm, he gave orders for the troops to take up the positions that had been assigned to them. With such a force as he had, however, which, with the exception of the small handful of regulars, was little better than a disorderly rabble, it was quite impossible to ensure obedience to any orders. The governor's Fanti bodyguard, whose sole duty was to remain with him and protect his person, took up a position on the extreme left of the line and steadfastly refused to quit it and return to the governor, saying they understood bush fighting and had now got a position that suited them. They had, for this position was the one nearest to Cape Coast. At about 2 o'clock, the Ashantis, who were considerably over 10,000 strong and were reinforced by another large body of men during the action, were heard advancing through the forest with drums beating and horns blowing. They halted within about half a mile of the English position, and Sir Charles then ordered the band of the Royal African Colonial Corps to play the national anthem, and the buglers to sound, because he had conceived the idea, from some strange source of information, that great numbers of the enemy, including several important chiefs, only wanted an opportunity to come over to him. He was soon undeceived, for the Ashantis defiantly sounded their horns and beat their drums in reply, but none of them, of course, came over. This pitiful absurdity of these proceedings surely culminated here. After some little time had been spent in this way, the enemy advanced by divisions in regular succession, each sounding the calls of their several chiefs, and lined the opposite bank of the river. A steady fire was now kept up for some time by both forces, which were only separated from each other by a stream about 60 feet wide. The Ashantis made more than one attempt to cross, but the river had been swollen by the rain and was unfordable, and though they felled several trees and tried to reach the opposite bank by climbing over them, they were driven back each time. By 4 o'clock, the English had expended the whole of their ammunition. Mr. Brandon, who had been specially ordered by the governor to have 40 rounds for each man packed in kegs and ready for immediate issue, had arrived during the action and was now applied to, but with the grossest mismanagement he had come on ahead of the carriers instead of driving them before him, with the natural result that when left to their own devices, hearing heavy firing in front of them and meeting the fugitives from the field of battle, they had not shown much enthusiasm in pushing forward, but had promptly thrown down their loads and fled. The consequence was, now that the ammunition was so urgently needed, there was only one barrel of powder and one of ball to be had. Nor was this all, for 3 other cases that had arrived at the same time proved on being opened to contain macaroni. The British force was now in a hopeless position, and no sooner did the Ashantis perceive that their fire was slackening than they made another determined effort to cross the stream, which had now subsided a little, and succeeded in fording it. The enemy closed in upon the little force from every side, pressing irresistibly forward and threatening to overwhelm it with their numbers and cut off its retreat. All who fell into their hands were instantly beheaded, and the fate of those who yet remained alive was plainly sealed. The Wassau's and Fantis had long since taken to their heels, and Sir Charles, who had been wounded, now joined Kujo Chibu, who was still fighting bravely with his Dankeras on the right of the line. It was evident that there was nothing to be done but to retreat in the best order possible. But every man of the Royal African Colonial Corps had gone to join his company, and not a bugler could be found to sound the call. A small brass field piece was found lying on the ground, still lashed to the poles on which it had been carried. This was quickly cut loose, its muzzle raised a little, and the gun loaded with some powder and a few musket balls obtained from the Denkeras, and fired through the bush in the direction of the enemy in the vain hope of checking their advance. It only served, however, to attract their attention to the spot and induced a charge in which the governor's and Captain Ricketts' West Indian orderlies were both killed. The governor had in the meantime left the Denkeras, and Captain Ricketts saw him a short distance ahead and was trying to overtake him, when a sudden volley was poured in by the enemy, and he lost sight of him. Knowing it would be hopeless to search for him in the dense bush, Captain Ricketts then turned back with the interpreter De Graft and some wounded men with the intention of rejoining the Denkeras, who, though retiring, were fighting bravely all the time and disputing every yard of ground. A militia sergeant now seized a Wassaw man as he ran past, and De Graft gave him a silver whistle and chain to guide them through the forest. They then pushed through the undergrowth, one man holding the guide to prevent his deserting them, until it became too dark for them to see each other. All this time, small parties of the enemy had been scouring the forest, and had more than once come so near to the fugitives that they had been forced to lie down and hide in the dripping undergrowth until they had passed. As the moon rose, a fresh start was made, but it was not until after another halt and day had broken that they had finally struck a small path leading to Insamankau. The guide left them there, and they almost ran into the arms of a party of the enemy, only retracing their footsteps in just in time. A little later they fell in with about 50 Wassaws and Denkeras, and it was agreed that they should push on together in the direction from which Major Chisholm was expected. That night was spent on a small island in the midst of a swamp, in reaching which Captain Ricketts lost both his shoes. While they were encamped there in the greatest discomfort, 2 Ashantis, who had mistaken them for a party of their own people, suddenly walked into their own midst. They were promptly seized by the Denkeras, who extracted all the information they could from them and then cut their throats. On the next day, as they were continuing their retreat towards the Pra, they fell in with another small party of the enemy, with whom a kind of running fight was kept up for some time, but they were eventually shaken off after several of them had been killed. During their march through the forest, Captain Ricketts and his party rescued several Wassaw women, but numbers of children were found starving on the ground, or lying with their brains dashed out, whose mothers had been captured by the Ashantis and compelled to abandon them that they might be able to carry more plunder. At length, after a terrible march in which everyone suffered acutely, they reached the Pra and halted on its banks for the night. Early the next morning they prepared to cross the river, but could only find one small canoe, which was so damaged that it would scarcely float. The women, however, were sent across, and after some delay the whole party reached the opposite bank. Captain Ricketts was now in a terrible condition. His clothes hung in ribbons, his feet were cut, bleeding and swollen, and after his long march barefooted through the forest, he was so exhausted from exposure, hunger and fatigue, and the pain and loss of blood from his wounds, that he could scarcely move. Soon after crossing the river, however, they fell in with 2 soldiers of the Royal African Colonial Corps, who, when they heard who he was, carried him to a village nearby, where a detachment of Major Chisholm's force that had been sent on to persuade the people on the line of march to join him was then halted. Major Chisholm himself arrived on the opposite bank a little later, and on being told of Captain Ricketts' terrible plight, sent him some clothes and provision, and soon followed in person. Nothing was yet known of the fate of Sir Charles Macarthy and the other officers with him, and it was thought possible that they too might have contrived to escape. It was not until towards the end of March, when Mr. Williams, who had been taken prisoner by the Ashantis, was released, that the full details of this disaster became known. He explained that he had left the field of battle with the governor, Mr. Buckle, and Ensign Weverall, and retreated along the path towards Isamankau. They had not gone far, however, when they were attacked by a party of the enemy. One of Sir Charles's arms was broken at the first volley, and he almost immediately afterwards fell with a second wound in the chest. He was carried to one side and laid at the foot of a tree, and Mr. Williams only had the time to see Ensign Weverall, who was also wounded, lying near the governor and cutting with his sword at some of the enemy who were trying to tear off Sir Charles's uniform, when he himself received a wound in his thigh and lost consciousness. He was brought to his senses by the clumsy attempts of one of the Ashantis to cut off his head. He had already received one gash in the back of his neck when an Ashanti captain, to whom he had once done some little kindness on the coast, recognized him and ordered his life to be spared. Lying near him, he saw the headless trunks of his three companions, and was then taken to the Ashanti camp at Isamankau. The Ashantis positively assert that Sir Charles committed suicide. He was badly wounded and helpless. Escape was absolutely out of the question, and he doubtless felt sure that if he was taken alive, he would be subjected to many indignities and possibly tortured before being put to death, and he may have felt that the wound in his chest was mortal. It is quite possibly true, therefore, that he did take his life at the last moment to avoid capture. No European actually saw the end, and the Ashantis can have no valid reason for inventing such a tale, unless in admiration, for it is a point of honor with their own chiefs to kill themselves when capture is inevitable. During the period of his captivity, which lasted 2 months, Mr. Williams was kept by day under a thatched shed, and shut up each night in a hut with the heads of Sir Charles and the other officers. These heads had been so well preserved that the features of the governor especially presented almost the same appearance as they had done in life. It was also stated that the principal Ashanti chiefs ate Sir Charles's heart in the belief that they would thus derive a portion of his indomitable courage, and that pieces of his flesh were smoke-dried and carried on their persons as talismans to protect them in battle. His head was afterwards taken to Kumasi and deposited in the treasury at Bantama, to be carried in procession as a signal trophy at every yam custom. Mr. Williams's only food was as such snail soup as he could hold in the palm of his hand, and had it not been for the wound in his thigh, he too would have been sent to Kumasi. The surgical procedures of the Ashantis, intended to force out the bullet, were as ineffectual as they were painful, and consisted in the application of very tight ligatures around the limb, above and below the wound. On the occasion of any sacrifice, he was made to sit on one side of the big deaf drum, while the victim's head was being struck off on the other. Among these victims was Mr. Jones, one of the traders in Cape Coast, and a captain in the militia, who, having received 5 wounds in the action, was by custom deemed to belong to the fetish. Another merchant, Mr. Raiden, was also put to death because he could not keep up with the Ashantis on the march after they had stripped him of all his clothes. In this battle, generally known as the Battle of Isamankau, though really fought on the banks of the Adumansu, some 20 miles from that place. The British losses were as follows. Killed. Officers. Brigadier General Sir Charles McCarthy, Governor. Ensign Reverall and Surgeon Beresford Tedley, along with J.S. Buckle, Colonial Engineer, all of the 2nd West India Regiment. Captain Heddle, Captain Jones, Captain Raiden, and Captain Robertson, Cape Coast Volunteer Company, along with Brandon, the Ordnance Storekeeper. The first 3 captains, Heddle, Jones, and Raiden, being merchants holding commissions in the Cape Coast Militia. Total officers 9. Men. 2nd West India Regiment, 2 dead. Royal African Colonial Corps, 41 dead. Royal Cape Coast Militia, 81 dead. Royal Volunteer Company, 54 dead. Total 178 dead. Wounded. Officers. Captain Ricketts of the 2nd West India Regiment. Ensign Erskine of the Royal African Colonial Corps, and William Williams, the Colonial Secretary. Total 3 officers wounded. What loss the irregular native allies sustained was never known, but in the case of the Wassals and Fantis, it was probably slight, as they seized the first opportunity to run away, very few of them remaining until the end. The Denkeras, however, who acquitted themselves with great credit, must have lost very heavily indeed, though no figures could ever be obtained. The irregulars, including the militia, fought well and bore the brunt of the battle. Only 22 of the Royal African Colonial Corps, 31 of the Cape Coast Militia, and 8 of the Volunteer Company escaped unscathed. The Ashantis also lost heavily. Many fell before the bayonets of the regulars, and many more must have lost their lives in the earlier attempts to cross the river and in the close fighting that took place afterwards. Probably their total loss reached several hundreds. Such then was the immediate result of this rash expedition, in which a mere handful of partly trained men was blindly led against unknown numbers of an enemy by no means to be despised and thoroughly conversant with the peculiar conditions of bush warfare. Its more remote results were still more serious. The Ashantis had hitherto entertained a profound respect for the power of the white man, but this decisive victory at once destroyed it and seemed to them conclusive proof of their own superiority. At the same time, this terrible reverse and the loss of the governor did more than anything else to produce that feeling of unreasoning and bitter hostility towards Ashanti that has existed ever since. It is this hostility, combined with the Ashanti's self-deception, that has done so much to create ill feeling and prolonged disputes, and caused losses of trade, wars, and other troubles that should never have been necessary. Sir Charles McCarthy, who thus paid the penalty of such foolhardiness with his life, must be pitied rather than blamed. As a stranger to the country, he had no idea of the strength and fighting qualities of his enemy, nor of the unreliable character of some of his allies, with many of whom the mere approach of an Ashanti army was sufficient to cause panic and flight. But even they cannot be blamed for running away on this occasion, for it was indeed their only chance, and they doubtless realized what the governor refused to believe, that he was attempting the impossible. As has been shown, too, he was placed at a great disadvantage by the refusal of nearly all the officers of the old company of merchants to serve under him, and was probably too easily led away by the vain boasts of the Fantis, while the enemy was still at a distance, and really believed that they would justify their words when the battle began. His folly in splitting up his small force into 3 and attempting to give battle with the weakest of all, however, is inexcusable. The gallant conduct of the Cape Coast militia, the volunteers and the Denkerers must always stand to their credit, but their numbers were not sufficient to avert the inevitable defeat, while the disgraceful and inexcusable blundering of the officer responsible for the supply of ammunition turned this into the greatest disaster that the English have ever suffered on the Gold Coast, and ended in the practical annihilation of the whole force.